The notification arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, its harsh blue glow cutting through the darkness of Rose's studio apartment like a blade through silk. She'd been dreaming of her mother's garden again, the way the morning glories climbed the white picket fence, how the soil smelled after summer rain, the sound of her mother's laughter drifting through open kitchen windows. But now she was awake, her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand, and the dream dissolved like sugar in bitter coffee. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Property Watch Alert. Mortgage activity detected on 1247 Magnolia Drive, Millbrook, NY. Rose sat up so quickly her head spun. Her fingers trembled as she read the message again, then again, as if repetition could somehow change the words. Magnolia Drive, her childhood home. The house where her mother had taught her to braid friendship bracelets on lazy summer afternoons, where Christmas mornings had sparkled with possibility, where every room held the echo of a woman's love who had been gone for 3 years now. The house that legally belonged to Rose, inherited free and clear when her mother passed away from pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2021. The house where her stepmother, Patricia, still lived, temporarily, or so Rose had believed. Rose's bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor of her apartment with purpose. She grabbed her laptop from the small kitchen table, pushing aside yesterday's takeout containers and a stack of unpaid bills. The Property Watch app loaded slowly, each second stretching like an eternity. When it finally opened, the details made her stomach drop to somewhere around her ankles. New mortgage application, $180,000. Lender, First National Bank of Millbrook. Property owner listed, Patricia Elizabeth Hammond Chen. Date of application, September 15th, 2024. Rose stared at the screen until her eyes burned. Patricia Elizabeth Hammond Chen. Her stepmother's maiden name combined with her late second husband's surname, a name that had absolutely no legal connection to the property on Magnolia Drive. Rose's mother, Sarah Chen, had left the house to her daughter in that had been probated without contest. Rose had the paperwork in a manila folder in her bedroom closet, next to her birth certificate and passport. The apartment felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in like they were made of cardboard instead of drywall. Rose's breathing became shallow and quick. She reached for her phone again, scrolling through her contacts until she found her stepmother's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a full minute before she set the phone down, her hands shaking too badly to trust herself to have a coherent conversation. Instead, she opened a new tab and began searching for property records in Millbrook County. The official website was clunky and slow, designed sometime in the early 2000s and apparently never updated. But eventually, she found what she was looking for. The deed transfer from her mother's estate to Rose Chen, dated May 18, 2021. Everything was in order, everything legal and proper and witnessed by her mother's attorney, Mr. Brennan. So how? Was Patricia applying for a mortgage on property she didn't own? Rose's mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Forged documents, identity theft, fraud. The word hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. She thought about Patricia's recent phone calls, cheerful and chatty, full of updates about the garden and the neighbors, mentions of a few repairs that needed to be done. Nothing that had raised any red flags. Patricia had always been theatrical, prone to small dramas and elaborate stories, but this was something else entirely. The grandfather clock in the hallway of Rose's building chimed 4 times, its deep notes reverberating through the thin walls. Rose pulled a sweater over her pajamas and made a pot of coffee, her movements automatic while her mind churned. She thought about her mother's final months, how Patricia had swooped in with casseroles and offers to help, how grateful Rose had been for the support. Her mother had been weak then, barely able to sign documents, relying on Patricia for everything from grocery shopping to managing medications. Rose remembered the day of the funeral, how Patricia had sobbed dramatically at the graveside, how she'd insisted on organizing the reception at the house afterward. "I loved Sarah like my own sister," she'd said through her tears. "This house holds so many memories for all of us." Rose had been too numb with grief to question why Patricia referred to it as all of us when she'd only married Rose's father 5 years earlier, and he'd died just 2 years after that. Now, sitting in her kitchen as dawn began to creep through the windows, Rose wondered what else she'd missed in those fog-filled months of mourning. She opened her laptop again and began a different kind of search. Patricia's social media profiles painted a picture of someone living well beyond her means. Recent photos showed expensive dinners, a weekend trip to the Hamptons, a new car, a sleek red convertible that definitely hadn't been in the driveway the last time Rose visited. Patricia's Instagram was full of aspirational lifestyle posts. Designer handbags, spa treatments, wine tastings at upscale restaurants. Rose did some quick math in her head. Patricia worked part-time at a local boutique, a job that probably paid minimum wage plus commission. Her social security from Rose's father couldn't be substantial. He'd been a high school teacher, not exactly a high earner. So, where was the money coming from for this suddenly lavish lifestyle? The answer sat in front of her on the laptop screen like a neon sign, the mortgage application for $180,000. Patricia was trying to steal Rose's inheritance and cash it in for a life of luxury. Rose's phone buzzed again. A text message from her best friend Mia. "Early morning crisis? Saw you were active on Instagram at 4 a.m. Everything okay?" Mia Chen Rodriguez, no relation despite the shared surname, had been Rose's anchor through every major storm in her adult life. They'd met in college, bonded over late-night study sessions and a shared love of terrible reality TV, and somehow maintained their friendship despite living in different cities and pursuing completely different careers. Mia was a social worker in Boston now, married to a kindergarten teacher named David, with twin daughters who called Rose Auntie Rosie and sent her crayon drawings through the mail. Rose typed back quickly, "Family drama. Can I call you later? Need to figure some things out first. Of course. I'm here when you're ready. Love you." The simple kindness of those words made Rose's throat tight with emotion. She set the phone aside and pulled out a legal pad from the kitchen junk drawer, the kind her mother had always used for grocery lists and birthday party planning. At the top of the page, she wrote, "What I know." Underneath, she began listing facts. House inherited legally on May 18, 2021. Patricia has been living there since Mom's death. Recent mortgage application under Patricia's name. Property alert system triggered. Photos on social media suggest sudden wealth. No legal claim to the property. Under that, she wrote, "What I need to find out. Has the mortgage been approved? Has Patricia forged documents? What other financial moves has she made? Who else knows about this? Why now, 3 years after Mom's death?" The coffee maker beeped, and Rose poured herself a large mug, adding more sugar than usual. She needed the energy and the comfort. Outside, her window, the city was beginning to wake up. Delivery trucks rumbled past, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gray. A jogger ran by with a small dog, their footsteps rhythmic on the sidewalk. Rose thought about her mother's hands, how they'd looked in those final weeks, thin and pale, with veins standing out like blue rivers on a map. Sarah Chen had been a planner, organized to a fault, the kind of person who labeled everything and kept important documents in clearly marked files. She would never have left something this important to chance. But what if Patricia had been more manipulative than any of them realized? What if those helpful visits during her mother's illness had been reconnaissance missions, opportunities to learn about bank accounts and legal documents and where important papers were kept? Rose pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. Mr. Brennan's law office answered on the 4th ring, an automated message informing her that office hours began at 8 a.m. She left a detailed voicemail, trying to keep her voice steady and professional despite the chaos in her chest. Then she called in sick to work. Rose managed social media accounts for a small marketing firm. Nothing glamorous or particularly well-paying, but it paid her bills and left her time to pursue her real passion, which was photography. She'd been saving up for better equipment, dreaming of turning her hobby into something more substantial. The irony wasn't lost on her that those dreams had been partially funded by the knowledge that she owned property, that she had something solid and valuable as a safety net. Now that safety net was being cut out from under her by someone she'd trusted, someone who'd eaten at her mother's table and claimed to be family. Rose's laptop chimed with an email notification. Her heart jumped, thinking it might be more news about the property, but instead it was from her camera equipment supplier, reminding her about a photography workshop she'd signed up for next month. The workshop cost $800, money she'd planned to take from her emergency savings, confident that she could afford it because she had the house as collateral if things got really tight. The betrayal hit her in waves. First, the practical concerns: money, legal implications, the threat to her financial security. Then the emotional impact, the violation of trust, the desecration of her mother's memory, the theft of something that represented more than just property value. The house on Magnolia Drive was Rose's childhood, her history, her mother's legacy. It was where she'd learned to ride a bike, where she'd cried over her first heartbreak, where she'd said goodbye to her mother for the last time. Patricia wasn't just stealing money. She was stealing Rose's past. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across Rose's small living room. She sat cross-legged on her couch, laptop balanced on a pillow, and began making a plan. First, she would talk to Mr. Brennan and understand exactly what legal protections she had. Then she would drive to Millbrook, a 3-hour trip from her apartment in Albany, and confront Patricia directly. But as she closed the laptop and headed for the shower, one question echoed in her mind like a bell tolling. What else had Patricia taken that Rose didn't know about yet? Rose's hands shook as she turned the key in her car's ignition, the engine coughing to life like an old man clearing his throat. The Honda Civic had seen better days, better years actually. But it had been her faithful companion through college and into her working life. The passenger seat was littered with the debris of her daily existence: empty coffee cups, camera equipment catalogs, a half-finished crossword puzzle from last Sunday's newspaper. She'd managed to reach Mr. Brennan's office just before lunch, and his news had been both reassuring and terrifying. Yes, Rose's ownership of the property was absolutely clear and uncontestable. No, Patricia had no legal right to mortgage the house. But yes, if she'd somehow managed to forge documents convincingly enough to fool a bank, the legal mess could take months or even years to untangle. And in the meantime, if the mortgage went through, Rose could find herself in a nightmare of litigation and financial liability. "The best thing you can do," Mr. Brennan had said in his measured, lawyerly tone, "is to get to the bottom of this immediately. Contact the bank, document everything, and if necessary, file a police report for fraud." A police report! The words sat in Rose's stomach like stones. She'd never even had a speeding ticket, and now she was contemplating filing criminal charges against someone who'd been part of her family, however tenuously, for the past 8 years. The drive to Millbrook took her through countryside she'd traveled countless times as a child, but today the familiar landscape felt foreign and ominous. Apple orchards stretched along the highway, their trees heavy with fruit that would soon be harvested. Farmhouses dotted the rolling hills, their windows catching the afternoon sunlight like eyes. Everything looked the same as it always had, but Rose felt like she was seeing it all through a different lens, one that revealed hidden shadows and potential deceptions. She stopped for gas in Cobleskill, a small town that served as the halfway point between her apartment and her childhood. While the tank filled, she called Mia. "Please tell me you're calling with good news. Mia said by way of greeting. I wish I could. Rose leaned against her car, watching other travelers come and go from the convenience store. A mother with 2 young children bought snacks and juice. Boxes. An elderly couple studied a road map spread across the hood of their sedan. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by family drama and potential fraud. Patricia is trying to mortgage my house, Mia. The house my mother left me. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats. Then, what? Do you mean trying to mortgage it? Rose explained everything. The property alert, the mortgage application, her conversation with Mr. Brennan. As she talked, she realized how surreal it all sounded, like something from a made-for-TV movie rather than her actual life. Jesus, Rose, this is serious fraud we're talking about. I know. Rose rubbed her forehead, feeling a headache building behind her eyes. I keep thinking there must be some explanation, some misunderstanding. Maybe she's confused about the legal ownership, or maybe she thinks she has some right to the property because she lived there with my dad. Honey. Mia's voice was gentle but firm. People don't accidentally apply for mortgages on houses they think they might own. This isn't confusion. This is calculated. Rose knew Mia was right, but acknowledging it felt like stepping off a cliff. Patricia had been present for some of the most important moments in Rose's adult life. She'd come to Rose's college graduation, bringing flowers and a card that said, "Your parents would be so proud." She'd sent birthday gifts and Christmas cards, always signed Love Patricia in her distinctive looping handwriting. When Rose had gotten her first real job after college, Patricia had called to congratulate her, genuinely excited and supportive. Had it all been an act? Had Patricia been planning this theft for years, playing the long game while Rose grieved and tried to rebuild her life? I'm driving there now, Rose said. I need to see her face when I ask her about it. Be careful, Mia warned. If she's desperate, enough to commit fraud, there's no telling what else she might do. Maybe you should call the police first. Let them handle it. I need to try to handle this myself first. She was married to my dad, Mia. She held my hand at his funeral. She brought me soup when I had the flu 2 winters ago. Rose's voice cracked slightly. Maybe there's still a chance to resolve this without destroying everything. After ending the call, Rose sat in her car for a long moment, watching clouds gather in the western sky. Weather was coming in, the kind of late September storm that would strip leaves from trees and leave the landscape looking bare and vulnerable. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at work. Hope you're feeling better. Don't worry. About the Henderson account. I've got it covered. Rose stared at the message, struck by the kindness of it. Her boss, Janet, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who ran the marketing firm with military precision, but she genuinely cared about her employees. The Henderson account was a big client, and Janet covering for Rose meant staying late and rearranging her own schedule. It occurred to Rose that her life was full of people like that. Janet, Mia, Mr. Brennan, even her elderly neighbor Mrs. Park, who always asked about her welfare and shared vegetables from her garden. Good people who kept their word, who could be trusted, who didn't scheme to steal from each other. Maybe that was why Patricia's betrayal felt so devastating. Rose had grown up believing that most people were essentially good, that family bonds meant something, that trust was the foundation of all meaningful relationships. Patricia's actions weren't just theft, they were an assault on Rose's fundamental worldview. The gas pump clicked off, and Rose replaced the nozzle with mechanical precision. Back in the car, she programmed her childhood address into her GPS, even though she could navigate to Magnolia Drive blindfolded. The electronic voice would give her something to focus on, besides the growing dread in her chest. As she drove the final stretch toward Millbrook, memories flooded back unbidden. She remembered the first time Patricia had visited their house, about 6 months after her father had started dating. Rose had been in her junior year of college, home for winter break, and skeptical of this new woman in her father's life. Patricia had been nervous then, eager to please, bringing homemade cookies and complimenting everything from the furniture to the family photos on the mantel. "Your mother had such beautiful taste," Patricia had said, running her fingers along the edge of a china cabinet that had belonged to Rose's maternal grandmother. "This house feels like a real home." Rose had warmed to her gradually. Patricia seemed to genuinely love Rose's father, and after her mother's death, Rose had been worried about him being lonely. Patricia cooked elaborate meals, organized social gatherings, and slowly brought life back to a house that had felt too quiet and sad. When Rose's father died suddenly of a heart attack 2 years later, Patricia had been devastated. She'd cried harder at his funeral than anyone except Rose herself. Afterward, she'd asked if she could stay in the house temporarily, just until she figured out her next steps. Rose's mother had been gone for 6 months by then, and the house felt impossibly empty. Having Patricia there seemed like a comfort, a way to keep some connection to her father's memory alive. "Of course," Rose had said. "Stay as long as you need to." That had been 3 years ago. Rose pulled into the driveway of 1247 Magnolia Drive, just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The house looked exactly as she remembered it from her last visit 6 months earlier. White clapboard siding with forest green shutters, a wraparound porch with hanging flower baskets, her mother's garden still blooming along the front walkway. Patricia had maintained it beautifully, Rose had to admit. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the flower beds weeded and mulched, the porch furniture arranged just as Rose's mother had always kept it. But now Rose noticed things she'd missed before. The new car in the driveway, a red BMW convertible that had to cost more than Rose made in a year. Expensive-looking outdoor furniture on the porch, the kind sold at high-end garden centers rather than big-box stores. A security system sign staked in the front yard, advertising a service that cost hundreds of dollars monthly. Rose sat in her car, engine running, and stared at the house where she'd learned to walk, where she'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, where she'd brought home her first boyfriend and endured her mother's gentle teasing afterward. The windows glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, and she could see Patricia moving around inside, probably preparing dinner or watching television, living the life of someone who owned a beautiful home without a mortgage payment. Living a life funded by Rose's inheritance. Rose turned off the engine and stepped out into the rain. The porch steps creaked under Rose's feet, the sound as familiar as her own heartbeat. She'd run up and down these steps thousands of times as a child, racing to catch the school bus, hurrying inside when her mother called for dinner, dragging herself up them as a teenager when coming home felt like entering a prison. The front, Doctor, was painted the same cheerful yellow her mother had chosen 15 years earlier, though it looked freshly touched up. Rose raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. Part of her wanted to use her key, to assert her ownership of this space, but that felt too aggressive, too much like an ambush. Despite everything, she still hoped this could be resolved with conversation and understanding rather than legal action. She knocked 3 times, the sound echoing off the porch ceiling. Footsteps approached from inside, quick and light. The door opened, and there was Patricia, looking exactly as Rose remembered her except for subtle changes that spoke of recent prosperity. Her hair was professionally colored and styled, the kind of highlights that cost hundreds of dollars. She wore a cashmere sweater that Rose didn't recognize, and her jewelry was noticeably more expensive than what she'd worn to family gatherings in the past. "Rose!" Patricia's face lit up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "What a wonderful surprise. I wasn't expecting you until Thanksgiving." The warmth in her voice made Rose's chest tighten with confusion. This wasn't the behavior of someone who'd been caught in a criminal act. Patricia stepped forward to embrace her, smelling of expensive perfume and cooking spices. The scent of home and deception mingled together. "Hi, Patricia." Rose allowed the hug, but didn't return it with her usual enthusiasm. "We need to talk." Something flickered across Patricia's face. surprise, wariness, or maybe just curiosity. But her smile remained bright and welcoming. "Of course, sweetheart. Come in, come in. It's getting nasty out there." Patricia ushered her inside, chattering about the weather and asking about Rose's job and whether she'd eaten dinner. "I just put a roast in the oven. Perfect timing." The interior of the house hit Rose like a physical blow. Everything was familiar, yet subtly wrong, like looking at a beloved photograph that had been slightly altered. Her mother's furniture was still there, but it had been rearranged. New artwork hung on the walls, expensive-looking pieces that definitely hadn't come from Patricia's teacher's salary. The living room had been redecorated with throws and pillows that cost more than Rose's monthly rent. But the changes went deeper than just new purchases. Rose realized with growing unease that many of her mother's personal touches were gone. The bookshelf that had held her mother's collection of mystery novels now displayed Patricia's romance paperbacks. Family photos had been rearranged, with pictures of Patricia and Rose's father moved to prominent positions, while photos of Rose's mother had been relegated to less visible spots. Most jarring of all, Patricia had hung a large portrait of herself and Rose's father in the place of honor above the fireplace, where a painting of roses, her mother's favorite flower and Rose's namesake, had hung for as long as Rose could remember. "You've redecorated," Rose said, struggling to keep her voice neutral. "Just a few touches here and there," Patricia replied, leading her toward the kitchen. "The house needed some updating, don't you think? Your mother had lovely taste, but it was getting a bit dated." The casual dismissal of her mother's aesthetic choices felt like a slap. Rose followed Patricia into the kitchen, noting more changes. New granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, a wine refrigerator that definitely hadn't been there during her last visit. "Patricia, I need to ask you about something." Rose remained standing while Patricia bustled around, checking on the roast and setting the table for two. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" Rose pulled out her phone and showed Patricia the Property Watch alert. "I received this notification this morning. It says you've applied for a mortgage on this house." Patricia's hands stilled for a moment, her grip tightening on the serving spoon she'd been using. Then she set it down carefully and turned to face Rose with an expression of confused concern. "A mortgage? I don't understand. There must be some mistake." The lie came so smoothly, so naturally, that Rose almost believed it herself. Patricia's face showed nothing but puzzled innocence, her eyebrows drawn together in apparent confusion. "The alert was very specific, Patricia. It listed your name as the applicant and this address as the property." "Well, that's impossible." Patricia's voice carried a slight tremor, the first crack in her composure. "I would never... this is your house, Rose. I'm just living here temporarily until I can find something of my own." Rose stared at her stepmother, searching for any sign of the truth in her face. Patricia looked back with wide eyes, the picture of wounded innocence. And Rose felt a momentary stab of doubt. What if there had been some kind of identity theft? What if Patricia was as much a victim as Rose herself? But then Patricia's gaze flickered away for just a second, and Rose caught a glimpse of something else in her expression. Calculation. Fear. The look of someone who'd been caught, but was still trying to figure out an escape route. "Patricia." Rose's voice was quiet but firm. "I know about the mortgage application. I know you listed yourself as the property owner. What I don't understand is why." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Patricia's composure began to crack, her shoulders sagging slightly, her fingers twisting the fabric of her expensive sweater. "Rose, sweetheart, I can explain. It's not what you think." "Then explain it to me." Patricia moved to the kitchen table and sank into one of the chairs, suddenly looking older than her 55 years. Rose remained standing, instinctively maintaining the physical advantage. "I was going to tell you," Patricia began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was going to talk to you about it at Thanksgiving. I didn't want you to worry unnecessarily." "Tell me what?" The house, it needs work, Rose. Major work. The roof is leaking, the electrical system is outdated, the plumbing in the upstairs bathroom needs to be completely replaced. Patricia's words came faster now, as if speed could somehow make them more convincing. I got estimates, and we're talking about $40,000 or $50,000 minimum. Rose felt a flicker of uncertainty. The house was old, and she'd noticed some minor issues during her visits. A water stain on the upstairs ceiling, occasionally flickering lights. But nothing that seemed catastrophic. Even if that's true, Rose said slowly, it doesn't explain why you're applying for a mortgage in your own name. Patricia's hands fluttered nervously, and she looked down at the table. I hoped, I could take care of it myself, handle the repairs and pay for them, and then we could work out the financial details later. I didn't want to burden you with this on top of everything else you're dealing with. The explanation had the ring of partial truth, but Rose could feel the holes in it like gaps in a puzzle. Patricia, you work part-time at a boutique. Where would you get $40,000 for home repairs? I have some savings, Patricia said defensively. And my credit is good. I thought I could get a home equity loan to cover the costs. A home equity loan on a house you don't own? Patricia's face flushed red. I thought, your father loved this house so much, and I've been living here, taking care of it, maintaining it. I thought maybe there was some kind of common law claim, or there isn't. Rose's voice was harder now, patience finally fraying. Patricia, this house belongs to me. Legally, completely, without question. Any mortgage you take out using this property as collateral is fraud. The word hung in the air between them like a curse. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed her hands to her face. I know, she whispered. I know it was wrong, but Rose, I'm in trouble. Real trouble. Rose felt the ground shift beneath her feet, as if the kitchen floor had suddenly become a ship's deck in rough seas. Patricia's admission hung in the air, between them, heavy with implications that Rose wasn't sure she wanted to understand. What kind of trouble? Patricia's tears were flowing freely now, carving tracks through her carefully applied makeup. She looked fragile suddenly, vulnerable in a way that tugged at Rose's protective instincts despite everything. After your father died, I made some poor financial decisions. I was grieving, not thinking clearly. Patricia's voice trembled with what sounded like genuine remorse. There was this investment opportunity. A friend of mine said it was guaranteed returns, completely safe. I put in everything I had saved, and then some. Rose sank into the chair across from Patricia, her legs suddenly unsteady. How much money are we talking about? $70,000. Patricia's voice was barely audible. My entire retirement fund, plus money I borrowed against my credit cards. The number hit Rose like a physical blow. $70,000 was more money than Rose had ever had at one time in her entire life. It represented years of work, careful saving, the security that should have carried Patricia through her golden years. And the investment? Turned out to be a Ponzi scheme. The man who ran it disappeared with everyone's money. The FBI is involved now, but they say we're unlikely to recover anything significant. Rose stared at her stepmother, trying to process this new information. If Patricia was telling the truth, then she wasn't just greedy, she was desperate. Desperation could make people do things they'd never consider under normal circumstances. When did you realize the money was gone? About 6 months ago. I kept hoping there would be some kind of recovery, that maybe the authorities would track down some of the assets, but it became clear that wasn't going to happen. 6 months ago. That timing aligned with when Rose had started noticing changes in Patricia's lifestyle, the expensive dinners, the new car, the upgraded wardrobe. But if Patricia had lost all her money, where had those purchases come from? Patricia, I don't understand. If you lost all your savings 6 months ago, how have you been affording all these new things? The car, the renovations to the house, the expensive clothes? Patricia's face crumpled further. Credit cards. I've been living on credit hoping something would work out. But now I'm maxed out on everything, and the minimum payments alone are more than my monthly income. Rose did quick math in her head. Patricia worked part-time retail, maybe 20 hours a week at minimum wage. That would be perhaps $600 a month before taxes. Her Social Security from Rose's father might add another $800. Even with no housing costs, $1,400 a month wouldn't cover car payments on a BMW, expensive dinners, and credit card minimums on $70,000 in debt. How much do you owe in total? Patricia was quiet for so long that Rose thought she might not answer. Finally, she whispered, $115,000. Maybe more. I've stopped opening the statements. The enormity of the debt made Rose's head spin. $115,000. It was a crushing, life-destroying amount of money for someone in Patricia's position. No wonder she'd been desperate enough to attempt mortgage fraud, but understanding Patricia's desperation didn't make her actions acceptable. Patricia, I'm sorry you're in this situation, I really am. But stealing my house isn't the solution. I wasn't stealing it. Patricia's voice rose sharply, then immediately softened again. I was trying to save it, for both of us. What do you mean? Patricia wiped her eyes with a tissue and took a shaky breath. The credit card companies have started calling constantly. I've missed several payments, and I got a notice that they might put a lien on my assets. What assets? You just said you don't have any money. That's just it, Rose. To the outside world, it looks like I have a significant asset, this house. I've been living here for 3 years. My address on all my credit card applications, my driver's license, everything shows this as my primary residence. If the creditors decide to pursue collection aggressively, they might try to claim the house as my asset. Rose felt a chill run down her spine. But they can't do that. The house is in my name. Can they? Are you sure? Patricia leaned forward urgently. I've been researching it online, Rose, and it's not as clear-cut as you might think. If someone lives in a property for an extended period and makes improvements, there are sometimes squatters' rights or adverse possession claims. And if creditors can show that I've been treating this as my primary residence and primary asset. The implications crashed over Rose like a cold wave. She'd been so focused on Patricia's mortgage fraud that she hadn't considered the possibility of other legal challenges to her ownership. What if Patricia's creditors did come after the house? What if there were lengthy court battles, liens and legal fees that could eat up the property's value even if Rose ultimately prevailed? So your plan was to mortgage the house before your creditors could claim it? My plan was to get enough money to pay off the debts and protect the property. I thought if I could take out a mortgage for the full value of the house, I could pay off all the credit cards, and then make arrangements to transfer everything back to you legally. Rose stared at Patricia, trying to determine if this explanation made any sense or if it was just another layer of deception. Patricia, that's still fraud. You can't take out a mortgage on property you don't own, regardless of your intentions. I know it wasn't legal, Patricia admitted, but I was trying to protect both of us. This house is your inheritance, Rose. It's all you have left of your parents. I couldn't bear the thought of losing it to credit card companies. The conversation was interrupted by the sharp ring of the kitchen telephone, an old-fashioned landline that Rose's mother had insisted on keeping for emergencies. Patricia startled at the sound, her face going pale. Aren't you going to answer it? It's probably another creditor, Patricia said quietly. They call 20 or 30 times a day now. The phone continued ringing, its shrill tone filling the kitchen. Rose counted 12 rings before it finally stopped. Almost immediately, it began ringing again. How long has this been going on? About 3 weeks. It started when I missed a payment to MasterCard. Now they all call constantly, sometimes the same company multiple times an hour. As if to prove her point, the phone rang again. This time, Patricia answered it with visible reluctance. Hello? Her voice was weary. Rose could hear an aggressive male voice on the other end, though she couldn't make out the words. Patricia's responses were monosyllabic. Yes. I understand. I don't have it right now. I'm trying to work something out. The conversation went on for nearly 10 minutes, with the caller becoming increasingly hostile and Patricia becoming more defensive. Rose watched her stepmother's face cycle through emotions: fear, shame, anger, desperation. When Patricia finally hung up, her hands were shaking. "That was American Express," Patricia said quietly. "They're threatening to sue me if I don't make a payment by Friday. That's 4 days from now." "How much do they want?" "The minimum payment is $850, but they want me to pay $3,000 to bring the account current." Rose felt overwhelmed by the scope of Patricia's financial crisis. It was like watching someone drowning in quicksand. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. "Patricia, have you talked to a bankruptcy attorney? With this much debt and your limited income, you might qualify for Chapter 7. Patricia's face twisted with something that might have been pride or shame. "I can't file for bankruptcy, Rose. It would destroy my credit for years, and I'd lose everything, including my right to live here." "You don't have a legal right to live here now," Rose pointed out gently. "I've been letting you stay out of kindness, but this house belongs to me." The words came out harsher than Rose intended, and Patricia flinched as if she'd been slapped. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Patricia's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and her face went even paler. "What is it?" "My car payment is overdue. They're threatening to repossess the BMW tomorrow." Rose looked out the kitchen window at the red convertible in the driveway. "How much are the payments on that car?" $650 a month. "Patricia!" Rose couldn't keep the shock out of her voice. "That's more than most people pay for rent. Why did you buy such an expensive car?" "I thought the investment money would cover it," Patricia said defensively. "I thought I'd have steady income from the returns, and I needed reliable transportation for work." Rose bit back her response. A reliable car for part-time retail work could be purchased for under $10,000, not the $60,000 or $70,000 that Patricia's BMW had likely cost. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of rain pattering against the windows. Rose stared at the woman who had been part of her family for 8 years, trying to reconcile the Patricia she thought she knew with this person who had made such catastrophic financial decisions. "There's something else," Patricia said quietly. Rose's stomach dropped. "What?" "The mortgage application. It wasn't just for this house." "What do you mean?" Patricia's voice became almost inaudible. "I also applied for a line of credit using your mother's jewelry as collateral." Rose felt the room tilt around her. "What jewelry?" "The pieces your mother left you. The diamond earrings, the pearl necklace, her wedding ring set. I had them appraised, and I used the appraisal to secure a $20,000 line of credit." Rose's mother's jewelry. The pearl necklace her grandmother had worn to her own wedding. The diamond earrings her father had given her mother for their 10th anniversary. The wedding ring set that Rose had planned to wear at her own wedding someday. "Where are they now?" Rose's voice was deadly calm. "They're safe," Patricia said quickly. "I haven't sold them or anything. They're in a safety deposit box at the bank. I was just using them as collateral." "You used my mother's jewelry as collateral for a loan without my permission?" Patricia's tears started again. "I was desperate, Rose. I didn't know what else to do." Rose stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the kitchen floor. She needed air, needed space, needed to get away from this conversation before she said something she couldn't take back. "I need to think about this," she said, moving toward the hallway. "Rose, please don't go. We can work this out together." But Rose was already walking toward the front door, pulling her car keys from her pocket. She needed to call Mr. Brennan. Again, needed to understand the full extent of the legal mess Patricia had created. As she reached for the door handle, Patricia's voice stopped her. "Rose, there's one more thing you should know." Rose turned around slowly, dreading whatever revelation was coming next. I got a call from First National Bank this afternoon. The mortgage application has been approved. Rose's keys fell from her, nerveless fingers clattering on the hardwood floor of the entryway. The sound echoed through the house like gunshots. Approved? The word came out as barely a whisper. Patricia nodded miserably. They want me to come in tomorrow to sign the final paperwork. The loan officer said it was one of the fastest approvals she'd ever processed. Rose leaned against the door frame, her legs suddenly unreliable. An approved mortgage meant that within days, possibly hours, Patricia could have access to $180,000 in cash. Money that belonged to Rose, secured by property that belonged to Rose, obtained through documents that Patricia had no right to sign. "You have to call them," Rose said. "You have to tell them it was a mistake." "I can't." Patricia's voice was barely audible. "What do you mean, you can't?" Patricia walked to the kitchen window and stared out at her BMW, its red paint looking garish against the gray evening sky. "They called this morning before you arrived, the car loan company. They're repossessing the car tomorrow at 8 a.m. unless I can make a payment of $3,000. Rose felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. "So you're planning to use stolen money to make a car payment?" "It's not stolen." Patricia whirled around, her composure finally cracking completely. "This house has been my home for 3 years, Rose. I've maintained it, improved it, paid for utilities and repairs and property taxes. I've put my own money and labor into this place." "Property taxes?" Rose's voice rose sharply. "I've been paying the property taxes. The bills come to my apartment." Patricia's face flushed red. "The first year, yes. But when the bills started, coming to this address, I paid them. I didn't want to bother you with it." Rose stared at her stepmother, trying to process this new information. If Patricia had been paying property taxes on the house, it could complicate the legal ownership in ways Rose didn't fully understand. It might give Patricia's lawyers something to argue in court, some basis for claiming she had a financial interest in the property. "How much have you paid in taxes?" "About $8,000 over the past 2 years. $8,000. Rose did quick mental calculations. The property taxes on the house were roughly $4,000 annually, which meant Patricia's numbers added up. But where had that money come from if she was so deep in debt? "Patricia, if you didn't have money for credit card payments, where did you get $8,000 for property taxes?" Patricia's silence was answer enough. She'd paid the taxes with more borrowed money, digging herself deeper into debt while creating a paper trail that could support a claim of beneficial ownership. Rose's phone rang, making both women jump. The caller ID showed Mr. Brennan's office number. "Rose, I've been trying to reach you. We have a serious problem." "I'm at the house now. Patricia told me the mortgage was approved. That's not the worst of it." Mr. Brennan's usually calm voice carried an edge of urgency. "I just got off the phone with the county clerk's office. Someone filed a quitclaim deed this afternoon transferring ownership of the property from you to Patricia Hammond Chen." The floor seemed to drop away beneath Rose's feet. "That's impossible. I didn't sign anything." "I know you didn't, which means someone forged your signature on a legal document. Rose, this is criminal fraud at the highest level." Rose looked across the kitchen at Patricia, who was watching her with frightened eyes. "Mr. Brennan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If someone has been living in a house for 3 years, paying property taxes and making improvements, do they have any legal claim to ownership? In New York State, adverse possession requires 10 years of continuous occupation, and even then, it only applies if the true owner doesn't object." "But Rose, why are you asking?" Rose closed her eyes. "I think Patricia may have been building a case for claiming ownership based on her residence and financial contributions to the property. That won't hold up in court, especially not with a clear will and probated estate. but it could complicate things enough to tie up the property in litigation for months or years. Patricia must have heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. She sank into a kitchen chair, her face gray with despair. "Mr. Brennan, what do I do?" "First, you need to file a police report immediately. Forging a quitclaim deed is a felony. Second, we need to get an emergency injunction to stop any mortgage closing. And third, you need to document everything, every conversation, every financial transaction, every piece of evidence you can find." Rose ended the call and stared at Patricia. "You filed a quitclaim deed." It wasn't a question, but Patricia nodded anyway. "I thought if I could establish clear ownership, the mortgage would be simpler to process." "Patricia, do you understand what you've done? This isn't just financial desperation anymore. This is felony fraud. You could go to prison." Patricia's composure finally collapsed completely. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. "I know," she gasped between tears. "I know it's wrong. But Rose, I'm drowning. I can't sleep, I can't eat. I can't think about anything except the debt. The phone calls never stop. They're threatening to garnish my wages, to sue me, to destroy my credit forever." I felt trapped. Despite her anger, Rose felt a stab of pity for Patricia. She'd never been in serious debt herself, but she could imagine the crushing psychological weight of it, the way it would color every waking moment with fear and desperation. But pity didn't excuse what Patricia had done. "I have to call the police," Rose said quietly. "Please don't." Patricia looked up, her makeup streaked with tears. "Rose, please, give me a chance to fix this. I can reverse the quitclaim deed. I can cancel the mortgage application. I can find another way to handle the debt." "How? How are you going to handle $115,000 in debt with no assets and a part-time minimum wage job?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I could sell the house and split the proceeds with you." Rose stared at her. "Patricia, you can't sell my house. But if we sold it together, we'd both get something. The house is worth at least $300,000, maybe more. That would be enough to pay off all my debts and still leave you with a substantial inheritance." The audacity of the suggestion took Rose's breath away. Patricia was proposing that Rose voluntarily give up half her inheritance to bail Patricia out of financial problems that were entirely of her own making. Absolutely not. "Rose, please think about it. What use is the house to you, really? You live 3 hours away, you have your own life. You could take the money and buy something smaller closer to where you work, or invest it, or travel. And I could start over with a clean slate." Rose realized with growing alarm that Patricia genuinely seemed to believe this was a reasonable proposal. In Patricia's mind, the house had become a shared asset simply because she'd been living in it. "Patricia, this house isn't just money too. Me. It's where I grew up. It's where my parents lived and loved and built their life together. It's where my mother spent her final years. I can't just sell it to solve your financial problems." "Your mother would have wanted to help," Patricia said desperately. "She was a kind person, Rose. She wouldn't have wanted to see me destroyed over money." The invocation of her mother's memory in service of Patricia's fraud felt like a physical blow. Rose stood up abruptly. "Don't you dare!" she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Don't you dare use my mother's memory to justify what you've done. My mother trusted you. She welcomed you into our family, and you've repaid that trust by stealing from her daughter." Patricia flinched as if Rose had struck her. "I never meant for it to go this far." "But it did go this far, didn't it? You forged legal documents, Patricia. You committed identity theft. You tried to steal my house and my mother's jewelry. Intent doesn't matter anymore." Rose pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when the dispatcher answered. "I need to report a case of mortgage fraud and identity theft." Patricia's sobs intensified, but Rose continued speaking to the dispatcher, providing her location and a brief summary of the situation. When she hung up, Patricia looked at her with pleading eyes. "Rose, they're going to arrest me." "Yes, they probably are. What about the house? What about my things?" Rose looked around the kitchen at the expensive appliances and renovations that Patricia had made with borrowed money. "I don't know, Patricia. That's for the lawyers and the courts to figure out." In the distance, Rose could hear sirens approaching. Patricia stood up unsteadily and walked to the kitchen sink, splashing cold water on her face. "I want you to know," Patricia said without turning around, "that I never meant to hurt you. I love you, Rose. You're the closest thing I have to a daughter." The words might have been touching under different circumstances, but now they felt manipulative, like one final attempt to play on Rose's emotions. "If you loved me," Rose replied, "you wouldn't have tried to steal from me." The sirens were getting closer now, their wailing echoing off the houses on Magnolia Drive. Rose wondered what the neighbors were thinking, what they would say when they learned that the woman they'd accepted as a member of the community was being arrested for fraud. Patricia turned around, and for a moment, Rose saw a flash of something else in her expression. Not just desperation or fear, but anger. "You have no idea what it's like," Patricia said, her voice suddenly cold. "You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. You have options. I'm 55 years old, Rose. I'm too old to start over, too old to rebuild. This house was my only chance at security. It was never your house to use, wasn't it?" Patricia's mask was slipping further, revealing something harder underneath. "I lived here. I maintained it. I loved it. I was more of a presence in this house over the past 3 years than you were." "When was the last time you visited, Rose? 6 months ago? A year?" The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Rose had been busy with her own life, her own struggles. She'd been grateful that Patricia was taking care of the house, relieved that she didn't have to deal with the emotional weight of the place where her parents had died. But that didn't give Patricia the right to steal it. The police cars pulled into the driveway, their red and blue lights painting the kitchen walls in alternating colors. Rose watched through the window as 2 officers approached the front door. Patricia smoothed her hair and straightened her sweater, composing herself with visible effort. "Rose, I want you to remember that everything I did because I was trying to protect this house. I was trying to save it for both of us." Rose didn't respond. She couldn't tell if Patricia genuinely believed her own justifications, or if she was still trying to manipulate the situation even as the police arrived to arrest her. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime a jarring contrast to the gravity of the moment. Rose walked to the front door, Patricia following behind her with slow, reluctant steps. As Rose reached for the door handle, Patricia spoke one more time. "I hope someday you'll understand that I had no choice." Rose opened the door to find 2 police officers, a middle-aged woman and a younger man, standing on the porch. Behind them, neighbors were beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion. "Ma'am, we're here about a report of fraud?" "Yes, officer. I'm Rose Chen, and I'm the legal owner of this property. This is Patricia Hammond Chen, my stepmother. She's been living here with my permission, but she's attempted to mortgage the house by forging documents and claiming ownership." The female officer looked past Rose at Patricia, who stood in the hallway with tears streaming down her face. "Ma'am, we're going to need to ask you some questions." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of questions, statements, and procedures that Rose had only seen on television dramas. The police officers were professional but thorough, treating the kitchen table like a crime scene as they documented Patricia's fraudulent mortgage application, the forged quitclaim deed, and the unauthorized use of Rose's mother's jewelry as collateral. Detective Sarah Martinez, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and kind eyes, took Rose's statement while her partner questioned Patricia in the wry living room. Rose found herself recounting not just the events of the past day, but the entire 3-year period since Patricia had been living in the house. "Did you ever give Ms. Hammond Chen permission to make financial decisions regarding the property?" Detective Martinez asked, her pen poised over a notepad. "No, never. I allowed her to live here temporarily after my father died, but we never discussed any kind of ownership arrangement or financial authority. And you were unaware that she'd been paying property taxes?" Rose hesitated. This was where the situation became complicated, where Patricia's actions shifted from clear-cut theft into murkier legal territory. "I received the tax bills at my apartment in Albany. I've been paying them annually. I had no idea Patricia was also making payments until she told me tonight." Detective Martinez made a note. "We'll need to check with the tax assessor's office to see if there were duplicate payments or if Ms. Hammond Chen was somehow redirecting the bills to this address." Through the kitchen doorway, Rose could hear Patricia speaking to the other officer, her voice alternating between tearful explanations and defensive justifications. Occasionally, Rose caught fragments of sentences. "Trying to protect the property. Never meant any harm. Like my own daughter. Detective." Martinez followed Rose's gaze toward the living room. "This is clearly difficult for you. Family situations like this often are." "She's not really family," Rose said, then immediately felt guilty for the words. "I mean, she was married to my father, but only for 2 years before he died. And she was never close with my mother. But you allowed her to continue living in your deceased mother's house?" Rose struggled to explain the complex emotions that had led to that decision. "I was grateful for her help during my parents' illnesses, and after my father died, the house felt so empty. Having someone there made it feel less abandoned." "Did you charge her rent?" "No. I probably should have, but it seemed wrong somehow. She was grieving too." Detective Martinez nodded sympathetically. "Grief can complicate everything, but it doesn't excuse fraud." Rose's phone buzzed with a text from Mia. "Saw the news online. Local paper has a story about police activity on Magnolia Drive. Are you okay?" Rose stared at the message, realizing that Patricia's arrest was probably already spreading through Millbrook's social networks. In a town of 8,000 people, police cars and detective interviews were major news. "Detective Martinez, will this become public information?" "The charges will be public record, yes. And given the nature of the crime, mortgage fraud involving a significant sum, there may be media attention." Rose thought about her job, her friends, the life she'd built in Albany. Would Patricia's crimes reflect on her somehow? Would people assume Rose had been involved, or at least negligent in allowing the situation to develop? What happens next? "We'll finish taking statements tonight, and then Ms. Hammond Chen will be taken to the county jail for booking. There will be an arraignment tomorrow where bail will be set. After that, it's up to the district attorney's office to decide how to proceed with prosecution." "Will I have to testify?" "Almost certainly, yes. This case will likely hinge on your testimony about the ownership of the property and your relationship with Ms. Hammond Chen." Rose nodded, trying to imagine herself in a courtroom, describing Patricia's betrayal to a jury. It felt surreal, like something happening to someone else. The detective's radio crackled with static, and she excused herself to step outside for a private conversation. Rose sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of Patricia's deception. The expensive appliances, the granite countertops, the wine refrigerator, all purchased with money Patricia didn't have, in a house Patricia didn't own. Rose opened the refrigerator, noting the high-end groceries inside. Organic produce, imported cheeses, a bottle of champagne that probably cost more than Rose spent on food in a week. Even Patricia's grocery shopping had been funded by fraud. "Rose?" Rose turned to find Patricia standing in the kitchen doorway, flanked by the second police officer. Patricia's hands were cuffed behind her back, and she looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of her situation. I wanted to say goodbye, Patricia said quietly. Rose didn't respond immediately. Part of her wanted to express sympathy, to maintain some connection to the woman who had been part of her family for 8 years. But another part of her, the part that felt betrayed and violated, remained silent. The house keys are on the hook by the garage door, Patricia continued, and the jewelry is in safety deposit box 247 at First National. The key is in the top drawer of the bedroom dresser. Thank you, Rose managed. Rose, I know you probably can't forgive me right now, but I hope someday you'll understand that I was trying to save something precious to both of us. The police officer gently guided Patricia toward the front door. As they walked through the living room, Patricia looked back one more time. Take care of the garden, she said. Your mother's roses are getting ready to bloom again. And then she was gone, leaving Rose alone in a house that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. Detective Martinez returned a few minutes later, tucking her radio back into her belt. The forensics team will be here tomorrow to document the fraudulent documents and gather additional evidence. You're welcome to stay in the house tonight, but please don't disturb anything in Ms. Hammond Chen's bedroom or home office. Rose hadn't even known Patricia had a home office. Where is her office? The small bedroom upstairs. It looks like she's been using it to manage her finances and coordinate the mortgage fraud. Rose's mother's sewing room. The place where Sarah Chen had spent countless hours creating quilts for charity auctions and baby blankets for friends' grandchildren. The idea that Patricia had turned that sacred space into a center for criminal activity felt like yet another violation. After the police left, Rose found herself wandering through the house like a ghost, seeing everything with new eyes. Each room held evidence of Patricia's deception. Expensive purchases mixed with family heirlooms, new furniture arranged around her mother's belongings. Photographs of Patricia and Rose's father displayed prominently, while pictures of Rose's mother were relegated to less prominent locations. In the living room, Rose studied the large portrait above the fireplace, Patricia and her father on their wedding day, both beaming with happiness. Rose remembered that day, how hopeful she'd felt about her father finding love again after her mother's death. Patricia had seemed genuinely devoted to him, patient with his grief, supportive of his relationship with Rose. Had it all been an act? Or had Patricia genuinely loved Rose's father, only to become someone else entirely after his death? Rose climbed the stairs to the second floor, her hand trailing along the banister that her mother had polished weekly with lemon oil. The wood was still smooth and well-maintained, evidence that Patricia had at least cared for the physical aspects of the house. The door to Patricia's makeshift office was closed. Rose hesitated, then turned the handle and stepped inside. The transformation was shocking. Rose's mother's sewing machine had been moved to a corner, covered with a sheet. The comfortable reading chair where Sarah Chen had sat to hand-stitch quilts was pushed against the wall, buried under boxes of financial documents. The center of the room was dominated by a large desk covered with credit card statements, loan applications, legal documents, and multiple computer monitors. Rose approached the desk cautiously, as if it might explode. The documents on top told the story of Patricia's financial downfall in stark detail. Credit card statements showing balances in the tens of thousands, late payment notices, collection agency letters. And underneath it all, carefully researched information about property law, adverse possession, and mortgage fraud. One folder was labeled Magnolia Drive Property Research. Rose opened it with trembling hands. Inside were printouts of New York, state property laws, highlighting sections about squatters' rights and beneficial ownership. There were photographs of every improvement Patricia had made to the house, meticulously documented with dates and receipts. Property tax payment records going back 2 years. Utility bills in Patricia's name. Even a notarized statement from a neighbor attesting to Patricia's continuous residence at the property. Rose sank into the desk chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Patricia's planning. This wasn't an impulsive decision born of desperation. This was a carefully constructed case for claiming ownership, built over months, or possibly years. But the most disturbing discovery was a handwritten timeline in Patricia's distinctive script. January 2022. Begin paying property taxes and utilities. March 2022. Start documenting home improvements. June 2022. Research adverse possession laws. September 2022. Establish safety deposit box for jewelry collateral. December 2022. Apply for credit. Using Magnolia Drive as primary residence April 2024. Investment scheme collapses. Debts become unmanageable August 2024. Begin mortgage application process. September 2024. File quitclaim. Deed Patricia had been planning to steal Rose's house for almost 3 years, since just a few months after Rose's father's death. The investment scheme that had supposedly triggered her desperate actions had actually happened 2 years into her carefully orchestrated fraud. Rose's phone rang, making her jump. The caller ID showed Mr. Brennan's office. Rose, I've been in touch with the district attorney's office. They're treating this as a serious white-collar crime. Patricia is looking at potential charges of mortgage fraud, identity theft, forgery, and grand larceny. How much prison time could she face? With the amount of money involved and the sophistication of the scheme, she could be looking at 5 to 10 years. Rose stared at Patricia's timeline, feeling sick. Mr. Brennan, I found something. Patricia has been planning this for 3 years. She has documentation going back to early 2022, months before she claims her financial problems began. Can you bring that documentation to my office tomorrow? The DA will want to see it. Of course. Rose hesitated, then asked, What happens to the house now? The quitclaim deed Patricia filed is fraudulent and will be voided. The mortgage application will be canceled. But Rose, you need to be prepared for the possibility that Patricia's creditors might try to claim she has some beneficial interest in the property based on her improvements and tax payments. Can they do that? It's unlikely to succeed, but it could tie up the property in court for months, and there might be liens placed on the house related to Patricia's debts. Rose closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Even with Patricia in jail, the consequences of her actions would continue to ripple outward, potentially destroying Rose's financial security and peace of mind. Mr. Brennan, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. If I'd been a better stepdaughter, if I'd visited more often or stayed more involved with the property, could I have prevented this? The lawyer was quiet for a moment. Rose, Patricia's actions were criminal. They weren't your fault, and they weren't your responsibility to prevent. You acted in good faith when you allowed her to live in the house. You couldn't have anticipated that she would repay your kindness with fraud. But as Rose hung up the phone and looked around Patricia's office of deception, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been naive, that she'd failed to protect something precious that had been entrusted to her care. Outside the window, Rose could see her mother's garden in the backyard, the roses Patricia had mentioned preparing to bloom again. The sight brought tears to her eyes. Her mother had spent decades cultivating that garden, nurturing it through seasons of growth and dormancy, teaching Rose that beautiful things required patience and care. Patricia had taken something beautiful and tried to turn it into a commodity, something to be mortgaged and sold and consumed. But the garden remained, waiting for someone who understood its true value. Rose wiped her eyes and began gathering Patricia's fraudulent documents. Tomorrow, she would turn them over to the authorities. Tonight, she would sleep in her childhood bedroom and try to begin the process of reclaiming her inheritance. But first, she had one more call to make. Mia? It's me. Can you talk? Rose, I've been worried sick. What's happening? Rose told her best friend everything. The mortgage fraud, the forged documents, Patricia's arrest, the 3 years of careful planning that had led to this moment. Mia listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of sympathy or outrage. "I feel so stupid," Rose concluded. "I trusted her completely. I never questioned anything. You trusted a family member who was living in your house with your permission. That's not stupid, Rose. That's normal human behavior." But the signs were there. The expensive lifestyle, the improvements to the house, the way she talked about the property like it belonged to both of us. Hindsight is 20/20. You can't blame yourself for not anticipating criminal behavior from someone you considered family. Rose looked out the bedroom window at the street where she'd learned to ride a bike, where she'd played with neighborhood children, where she'd walked to school every morning for 12 years. "Mia, what if I lose the house? What if Patricia's creditors manage to tie it up in court for years?" "Then you'll figure it out. You're stronger than you think, Rose. And you have people who love you and will help you through this." "I keep thinking about my mother, about how disappointed she would be. She always said family was about taking care of each other. Your mother would be proud of how you're handling this. You discovered the fraud, you called the police, you're protecting your inheritance. That's exactly what she would have wanted you to do." After ending the call, Rose walked through the house one more time, turning off lights and checking locks. In the kitchen, she found the roast Patricia had been cooking when she arrived, now cold and forgotten in the oven, a fitting metaphor for the evening's revelations. As she climbed the stairs to her childhood bedroom, Rose thought about the timeline. Patricia had created the careful documentation of her fraudulent claims. Patricia had been planning this theft since 2022. But Rose realized now that the seeds of deception might have been planted even earlier. Had Patricia married Rose's father with this in mind? Had she seen the house on Magnolia Drive and recognized an opportunity, a valuable asset owned by an aging man with a naive daughter who lived far away? The questions would haunt Rose for weeks to come, but tonight she was too emotionally exhausted to pursue them further. She climbed into the bed where she'd slept as a child, surrounded by the ghosts of happier times, and tried to imagine what her future would look like. 6 months later, Rose stood in her mother's garden, watching the morning glories climb the white picket fence exactly as they had in her childhood dreams. Patricia had been sentenced to 4 years in prison for mortgage fraud and identity theft, though she would likely serve less with good behavior. The fraudulent mortgage had been canceled, the quitclaim deed voided, and Rose's ownership of the house legally reaffirmed. But the victory felt hollow. Patricia's creditors had indeed attempted to place liens on the property, claiming she owed them money secured by her residence at Magnolia Drive. 3 different credit card companies had filed lawsuits, and Rose had spent nearly $15,000 in legal fees fighting them off. Mr. Brennan had been right. Even fraudulent claims could tie up property for months while courts sorted through the mess. Rose had ultimately decided to sell the house, not because she had to, but because staying felt impossible. Every room held memories tainted by Patricia's deception. The kitchen where they'd shared meals was the same place Patricia had lied to her face about the mortgage application. The living room where Patricia had sobbed about her financial troubles was where she'd displayed that timeline of calculated theft. The sale had closed last week for $310,000, enough to pay off all the legal bills, settle some remaining disputes with creditors, and leave Rose with a substantial nest egg. She'd used part of the money to upgrade her camera equipment and enroll in a photography business course. The rest sat in a savings account, earning interest while she decided what came next. Standing in the garden on this final morning, Rose felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. The roses her mother had planted decades ago were blooming magnificently, their scent carrying on the warm spring breeze. Patricia had been right about one thing. Rose's mother would have wanted the garden cared for. The new owners, a young couple with twin toddlers, had promised to maintain it. Rose's phone buzzed with a text from Mia. "Moving truck on schedule?" David made coffee for the road trip. Rose smiled, looking around the garden one last time. She was moving to Boston to be closer to Mia's family. to a small apartment near the harbor where she could build a photography business focused on weddings and family portraits. The kind of work that celebrated love and commitment instead of documenting their betrayal. She'd learned hard lessons about trust, about the difference between kindness and naivety, about protecting what mattered most. Patricia's scheme had cost Rose more than money. It had forced her to grow up in ways she'd never anticipated. But as she walked toward her car, Rose realized something surprising. She was grateful. Not for Patricia's crimes, but for the strength she'd discovered in herself when everything fell apart. For friends like Mia, who showed her what real family looked like. For the knowledge that she could survive betrayal and come out stronger. The house on Magnolia Drive would always be part of her story, but it was no longer her anchor. She was. Rose drove away without looking back, ready to build something new. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.